Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the 2025 to 2026 residency year clinical peril series. Today, I'll be presenting on the MajesTEC 3 trial that examines the utility of teclistamab and daratumumab in patients with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. For the objective of this presentation, I will first introduce the background of this clinical trial, describe study parameters, then go into more details about the strengths and limitations of the study and results, and then describe the implications based on the results of the study. Teclistamab or Tecvayli is a bispecific antibody that first received FDA accelerated approval on October 25th, 2022 for the treatment of relapsed refractory multiple myeloma in adult patients that have had at least 4 prior lines of therapy that included a proteasome inhibitor, immunomodulator, and anti-CD38 agents. The utility of teclistamab and daratumumab for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma was first examined in the phase 1 to 2 MajesTEC 1 trial that enrolled 165 patients, majority of which had triple class refractory disease and a median of 5 previous lines of therapy. What they found was that the overall response rate was seen in a majority of patients, 35% of which had a complete response or better. Around 27% of patients had no minimal residual disease. And then for median duration of progression-free survival, it was around 11 months. And then for median duration of response, it was 18.4 months. Now, with the MajesTEC 3 trial, it directly compared teclistamab and daratumumab in patients with multiple myeloma who have experienced disease progression after 1 to 3 previous lines of treatment to other standard of care treatments, in which patients in the other group would receive daratumumab with or without dexamethasone and the investigator's choice of pomalidomide or bortezomib. The MajesTEC 3 trial is a phase 3 open-label multi-center randomized trial that was sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, which is also the company that manufactured teclistamab. It enrolled adult patients with multiple myeloma who have received 1 to 3 prior lines of treatment. That includes a proteasome inhibitor and lenalidomide. But it did exclude patients who have received any prior BICMA-directed therapy, those who've had autologous transplant within 12 weeks before randomization, those who've had allogeneic transplant within 6 months before randomization, and those who would have any conditions that would predispose them to lower life expectancy or unnecessary harm. Like I said previously, it directly compared teclistamab and daratumumab to other standard of care treatments that was mentioned on previous slide. And look to measure progression-free survival, and then for secondary outcomes, complete response, overall survival, minimal residual disease negativity, and worsening of symptoms, which was reported based on patient response to a questionnaire. For statistical analysis, they use a lot of standard measures such as a stratified Cox regression model to estimate hazard ratios and 95% confidence intervals, a two-sided stratified log rank test to directly compare time to event endpoints between groups, as well as the O'Brien-Fleming boundaries to determine exact significance level for superiority at the progression-free survival primary analysis. For the noble baseline characteristics, both groups did not have significant differences in characteristics. However, there were some characteristics that are worth pointing out. In particular, there wasn't a higher percentage of patients that had high cytogenetic risk. So most patients in these groups had more favorable prognostics. Median number of previous lines of therapy was 2, and majority of patients were also refractory to an immunomodulator. Now, for the results, they end up finding that the teclistamab and daratumumab group had much better efficacy results overall when it came to 36-month progression-free survival, complete response, overall response, minimal disease negativity, and the percentage of patients that reported no worsening of symptoms after 36 months. Now, when it came to the safety results, patients in both groups did experience adverse events of any grade. However, the teclistamab group did have a higher percentage of patients that had treatment interruptions or delays, but the teclistamab group did have a much lower percentage that led to treatment discontinuation, and both groups did have patients who experienced neutropenia of any grade and of grade 3 and higher. What the authors ultimately concluded based on the results of the study is that treating patients with multiple myeloma with teclistamab and daratumumab after they've failed 1 to 3 previous lines of therapy would likely yield significantly longer progression-free survival time than those who were treated with DPD or DVD. Based on the study parameters, what they did well is that there was a direct comparison between teclistamab and daratumumab to another preferred treatment option according to NCCN guidelines. They also did not have significant differences in the baseline characteristics, and they were also mostly represented patients with multiple myeloma. And the results of this trial are also applicable to the patient population at Monument Health due to the fact that majority of study participants were enrolled from the United States and other Western countries. Despite the strengths of this study, there are limitations that may confound how efficacious teclistamab and daratumumab can be for this patient population. Notably, the trial did not compare teclistamab and daratumumab to BiCMA-directed CAR-T therapies like Carvykti. This is important to consider because CAR-T therapies have shown efficacy in patients with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. So by not having this direct comparison, it's not clear which treatment option is the best possible treatment option for patients with relapsed refractory disease, which is why the NCCN guidelines lists CAR-T therapy and bispecific T-cell engagers as preferred treatment options for those who've been on 3 prior lines of therapy. The study also did exclude patients who received at least 4 lines of therapy, so it's not known how beneficial teclistamab and daratumumab could be for patients who failed more lines of treatment. There was also an underrepresentation of patients of African descent, since this patient population does have a higher incidence of multiple myeloma. In addition, when it came to the worsening disease results, the reliability of how these symptoms are reported based on the multiple myeloma symptom and impact questionnaire is dependent on patients being truthful and having an adequate understanding of their clinical presentations. This is especially problematic since the questions regarding pain and other signs of discomfort are subjective. So that result can really vary depending on how patients in the treatment groups interpret the questions. Lastly, Johnson & Johnson is not only the sponsor of this trial, but also the manufacturer of teclistamab, so it would benefit financially from positive results of this trial. This slide is just to show the NCCN guideline recommendation after 3 prior lines of therapy, where, like I said previously, CAR-T therapies and bispecific T-cell engagers are both preferred options for relapsed refractory disease after 3 prior lines of therapy. But the NCCN guidance currently does not recommend one option over the other based on the fact that there hasn't been trial results published at the time of recording that shows that one treatment option is better than the other. For place in therapy, the NCCN guidelines did recently update the multiple myeloma section to include the daratumumab and teclistamab regimen as Category 1 options after a patient has experienced relapsed refractory disease after 1 of 3 prior therapies, in which one of these prior therapies was including lenalidomide and a proteasome inhibitor. This makes sense because the trial did show a significantly better efficacy outcome when compared to other standard of care options as shown in these guidelines. Hope you all learned something today. These are the references that I used for this presentation. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me at cchan1@mindman.health. Thank you.